Hey guys, welcome back to Quick Tips. Today we're going to be talking about how to speed up your workflow through exporting. And honestly, this is a big topic and I'm going to try and simplify it down because assuming that you've worked in other Creative Cloud or really any other application before, you've had to deal with this conundrum of what file type do I export as? What's the best way of doing it? How do I get my file size small enough? And a lot of times, how do I save this out to show it to a client so that they can't just rip off what I sent them and not pay me? So let's talk about that for a second. And really quickly, I'm just going to talk about how Illustrator has divided up its two ways of exporting things. And that's necessary to know the difference between vector and flat or rasterized objects or files. Vector is what an Illustrator file is. It allows you to infinitely scale objects. It's pretty much written into code, whereas rasterized or flat images are where things become pixels. So we're just going to talk about that for a second. Within your file, either save as or export menus, they are more or less divided up into the ones that save your vector editability and the ones that don't, that flatten it, compress it. So file save as is where you're going to get your file types that save the vector aspect. So AI, EPS, PDF, SVG. The other ones are there. I don't actually use them ever. These are I'm just going through the ones that I use the most often. So these all preserve that editability, whereas export for screens, we can talk about in a second. Export as, these are more or less the ones that flatten it. I'm just going to move that up so you can see the full drop down. These are more or less the ones that flatten or compress your file size so that, number one, you lose your vector editability, with the exception of SVG, which was also in the file save as menu. But a lot of these, some of them will save your layers. Like if you save it as a Photoshop file or a TIFF, it can save your layers in there, but it doesn't always preserve vector editability. So JPEG, PNG, SVG, TIFF, and sometimes PSD files are the ones that I use the most here. Let's talk quickly about the file export for screens. This is honestly just a really good way to export your artboards to a bunch of different sizes and scales. If you're using this for UI, UX, you can set the scale, you can set the formats, you can add different things. It'll add it into subfolders. Super handy, especially when you got to get a lot of stuff out or you need to upload it to InVision or a PDF or whatever else it is. However you're representing or showing your work, files or file export for screens is super helpful for that. So now I just told you, the split between export versus save as. Let's talk about the different file types and when you might use them. These are the 7 file types I use the most when exporting from Illustrator, and they have different uses and different reasons why you would want to do it. Quick definition: I explained vector earlier. Alpha is transparency. Essentially, a pixel has a alpha value associated with it. How transparent is it? And then ability to keep your layers. So AI keeps everything. Obviously, that's where your live files are. A PDF, a lot of people don't know, is actually, if it was built in Illustrator and has that check mark saved when it's exported, it acts the same as an AI file. You can actually just delete in the file name in your Finder window, delete the .pdf and switch it to AI. It'll change it to an AI file. However, the difference is PDFs are mostly meant for sharing things out. Almost every computer can open a PDF nowadays. So it's a very simple way to go from an Illustrator file, save as PDF. You've got essentially all of your artboards shared out into a document. And it oftentimes can bring down the file size a lot. If it doesn't, you can take it into Adobe Acrobat. And from there, you're able to optimize the file size. And I have a whole other video on that. EPS is usually used for printing applications. If you are going to print out some t-shirts, a lot of the time the printer will ask for an EPS file format. It preserves the vector. It's really helpful to have as a client. So I always make sure to export an EPS just so that they don't come asking later, like, hey, do you have this thing? And you have to re-export everything. SVG is used for digital applications a lot of the time. This is built into web and that sort of thing. If you've ever seen an animation on a website draw on a cool vector illustration, it's most likely an SVG. That they are animating in real time in the code via the browser. So, as we said earlier, vector is written into code. You can say this anchor points at this point, and there's this kind of curve that attaches to it. SVG is able to do that within code and just be put into digital applications. So that's super helpful to pass off as well. TIFFs I don't use that much, but they are a very high resolution. They keep the layers, but they are a very high resolution flattened file. They don't have that vector editability. So I think there might be ways to keep it. I don't ever use it that way. I usually just stick with the ones that aren't flattening anything or converting to paths or anything like that. PNGs and JPEGs. A lot of people don't know the difference between the two. The main difference is the alpha. PNGs are transparent, JPEGs are not. So that's pretty much the gist of it. Of course, if you take a PNG of a flat thing with no transparency, it's going to act the same as a JPEG. When you're exporting for mobile developers or things like apps that need to have very, very small file size, I would recommend doing JPEGs because that alpha is just an extra amount of memory that needs to be written into that file. So that's more or less that. Take a screenshot if you ever need to reference this again. File handoff, like I said earlier, I usually recommend giving them everything up front so you don't have to worry about the client coming back and saying, hey, do you also have this? My general go-to is I'll export JPEGs, PNGs, SVGs, and EPS. And from that, they don't need the native AI files. They don't need a PDF or anything because they've got the vector editability from the SVG and the EPS. Last but not least, I am a big fan of screenshots. If you don't know how to use them, Shift-Command-4 gives you a cursor that you can drag a particular screenshot. I think it's so helpful because number one, you don't have to go up to any menus to hit export. You have to go through all the selection. You just select what you're looking at. It brings it up as a screenshot. It's perfect. It's done. What's great about screenshots is it's flattened your artwork, just like a PNG would. It's really fast, obviously, and you can control what you're looking at. It helps me, especially. I like to include a lot of like the gray behind for my workspace, so that clients can see that it's like a work in progress or it's not like a finalized thing, because we've all had that experience where a client thought it was final and started using it and you're like, whoa, that wasn't what I meant. It also helps protect your work. You're able to send, I like sending screenshots to clients so that they can see the work without having the ability to like rip it off. You want to be able to preserve and protect the ability that you have within those files until you're getting paid. If you hand over an AI file before you're paid, you're really relying on the trust system there that they're going to pay you because they have the live files. You don't have any leverage for anything. So with that being said, exporting tips, I highly recommend using the keyboard shortcuts as best as you can. Save as, save, so you don't have to go up to those menus. And then I highly recommend memorizing, what file types do what, and using screenshots as a mode of exporting incredibly fast. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. But with that, that's your quick tip for the day.